Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr Gray. This debate from my colleague from Truro and Falmouth is a very timely one, because we need to restate again that climate change is real, and the climate emergency that Parliament has declared means we must do things differently. The climate emergency declaration that this House passed is not just a statement of intent, it is a challenge to business, to government, to society, to individuals, and it comes with a very basic question. Now that Parliament has declared a climate emergency, what are you doing differently? If the answer is nothing, then that's not a good enough answer. If the answer, as I've heard from many corporates, is the same insufficient amount as they were doing before, but with more topspin, that is not a good enough answer. If the answer is parking action far off many decades away, so you don't have to take the action now, that's not a good enough answer. Mr Gray, more spin won't do it. More the same won't do. We need bold and determined action, and that means being more ambitious and swifter in our action, and more honest with the people about what massive changes to the way we live, work, travel and consume will be required to hit net zero, be that by 2050 or by any other date. It also means that we need government to put as much effort into the climate emergency as they are with Brexit. So I asked the Minister, can he pass on to his Treasury colleagues that the autumn budget must be as much a climate emergency budget as a pre-election budget, as a Brexit budget. It needs to cut through on every single aspect of addressing the climate emergency. Nothing less will do. But that also means that MPs like me need to readjust our own campaigns. My campaign to see the M5 extended from Exeter to Plymouth means that we must bring forward the date of getting rid of diesel and petrol engines to make sure it's only electric cars that use that extended road. And the campaign to reopen Plymouth Airport means we must not have planes using aviation fuel landing at that airport. We must have electric aviation there. These are big challenges that require very big and bold investments by government, and we need those investments now, because putting it down the line will only make achieving net zero by 2050 or by 2030, as I would like and as the Labour Party has proposed with our brilliant Green New Deal motion at conference, harder to achieve. So let's have swifter action now and more honesty from ministers about how much change is required to get there. Thank you.
Damian Hines.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I welcome the new Minister to her place. As a South West MP, it's good to see a South West combo on both sides of the dispatch box, and good to see that she's in a position of responsibility where she will be able to use her considerable knowledge, in particular an area that she knows that I feel strongly about, as does she, about soil health as well. And soil health is kind of related tangentially to plant health here, and so I would just like to start by saying that the opposition does not oppose this statutory instrument today, so we won't be opposing it. However, we are grateful that the government has chosen to correct mistakes and omissions in previous SIs in relation to this. Once again, with the plant health regulations, what we're here to do is make amendments to amendments, because the previous amendments fell short of what was required at the time. Regular watchers of these SI debates on Parliament Live.tv, and I'm sure there are many of them, will know of the concerns shared by my honourable friends, the members for Stroud, for Workington and for Ipswich, the Shadow DEFRA team, that these SIs are sometimes being rushed through, and mistakes or gremlins, as I call them, can be baked into them, not only in the work of the officials, but also in the lack of time for proper scrutiny within the House by members, but also by stakeholders as well. And this SI, I think, confirms just that rushed legislation being pushed through will then need to be amended further in the future because there were omissions at the time. And that creates the potential for a polluted statute book, which I think is something that we would all want to avoid, especially in an area as important and as technically detailed as plant health. Indeed, my honourable friend for Ipswich said on the 19th of March, when this regulation was last considered, I confidently predict there will be mistakes, perhaps not in these particular SIs, but in some of them, and they will have serious consequences for our residents and businesses over and above the massive overarching mistake which is the government's handling of Brexit. Now, ignoring the bigger Brexit position that my honourable friend was talking about, I think it is important that we state that when the government does find errors and omissions in SIs, as here, I support the government bringing amendments to those SIs to the Chamber, and that's why we're not opposing this one today. I'm grateful for the Minister setting out in a tongue twister of a statement that she had to say that there were technical deficiencies and inoperabilities with this regulation in the past. This was not on her bailiwick at the time when this was first done, but I think it was in the flood of statutory instruments being proposed by her department in the lead up to one of the early exit days to push through as many as possible, and at the time the opposition raised concerns about how comprehensive those SIs will be. Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to briefly turn to the explanatory memorandum because it's just as important sometimes as the regulations themselves. It suggests, even implicitly, that this is a mere updating of the last SI with new regulation. However, in reality, if we take one example, the EU Commission implementing decision of 2018-1959, which concerns the preventing Agrilis panipennis being introduced into the EU, was passed on the 10th of December 2018. The Agrilis planipennis is incredibly damaging to the European ash trees, and so the government is correct to legislate against the introduction of this to the UK and put in places to protect our own trees because of it. My question is, why was this not implemented when we last considered this area here? And can the Minister just explain to the House what process her department is taking to look at the statutory instruments that have been passed by Parliament to check that there were no omissions, especially in that real surge period of statutory instruments that we saw in February, March of this year, before one of the early exit days. The previous SI, which this one amends, was needed to correct errors and omissions in the Plant Health EU exit regulations. Does the Minister concur with our assessment that the process that was followed in some of those was unsatisfactory and that improvements to the process could be made? And if the Minister does agree with that, can she set out how her department is addressing that? Because I think there is cross-party agreement that getting this right is important, but sometimes getting things that are very technically right can take a few goes. But we want to make sure that the system the Minister is using is as robust as possible. The Minister may know one of my penchants in the statutory instruments is to look at the impact assessments, and I am not going to disappoint anyone who is concerned about the impact assessment on this one. I am not a fan of the phrase that there is no or no significant impact in impact assessments in explanatory memorandums. No and no significant impacts are two very different things. No impact suggests that there is no change to it, and no significant impact suggests there is, but you haven't measured it. Again, in this case here, no impact assessment has been taken to understand where there is an impact by this or not. And I would encourage the Minister, as I have done every one of her predecessors in her role, to work with the House authorities and the Leader of the House to correct that language, because I think there is a difference between no and no significant impact, and especially as we're seeing with this SI, that is a correction of the previous SI that corrected regulations. We need to be getting this right. I just briefly want to now turn to biosecurity and Northern Ireland and in relation to customs. The Minister set out in her opening remarks about the territorial application of this SI, and it affects different parts of the UK differently for different parts. Given the volume of UK-EU trade, especially across the Ireland-Northern Ireland border, which we hope will not be diminished as a result of any of the Brexit arrangements her government is pursuing, the current system for sharing biosecurity intelligence with EU countries risks being lost if there's not an agreement to make sure that information sharing takes place. Now, what we've seen in the last few days is a potential threat to information sharing between the UK and our EU friends as part of posturing around the Brexit deal negotiations. Can the Minister set out clearly for the House here that information sharing in relation to biosecurity and plant health security, especially around invasive species, will not be affected by any posturing that comes from Downing Street, and that this regulation includes the ability to share properly the information that we need between ourselves and our EU friends. Now, the Minister's predecessor referred in the previous Plant Health SI committee to contingency plans to develop a database to capture interceptions and incursions and share information with the European Union where those incursions have been recorded. Can I ask if that database is ready? If not, how long after the proposed exit day, and let's, for the sake of argument, assume it's the 31st of October, although I suspect many of us think it's not. How long after that exit day will it be ready, and how many interceptions and incursions does the Minister anticipate the system recording, and what action will be taken to contain them as they are identified? The House of Lords EU Committee report said the need to facilitate trade post-Brexit must not be allowed to compromise the UK's biosecurity, probably something that everyone on this, on all sides of the House would agree with. So can I ask the Minister how her department will guarantee that we face no increased biosecurity risks and maintain alignment with the EU, especially in data sharing, in any Brexit arrangements? The plant health regulations set up lists for England, Wales and Northern Ireland that seek to replicate the current set of EU lists that are in relation to plant health. They can ensure that protected zones can continue to be protected from pests and that emergency measures can continue to be applied where necessary. However, a large raft of the EU legislation that accompanied those lists is proposing being revoked. Can I just check in with the Minister that as mistakes have been identified in the previous SI, that it's still the Minister's intention to revoke those parts of EU regulation to make sure that there is no errors in the emissions in that respect? Now, my honourable friend from Clwyd South mentioned that the EU Plant Health Directive requires checks on material imported from third countries at the first point of entry into the EU. However, once we've left the EU, and if that happens, the intention is to allow plant material from third countries to pass straight through the EU without checking, to enter the EU without checking at the border, and to rely on checks at the destination premises of the importers. Can I ask the government ask the Minister how she intends to ensure that all plant material brought into this country in that manner from third countries without checks will actually be checked? Because it is important that we ensure that there's no invasive species, pests or diseases on those containments of plants that can escape into our natural environment. And as the Minister set out in her speech, there's a number of different pests and diseases that can affect UK species that we would want to seek to avoid. And especially as we see the effects of climate change, with changes in our own climate, the amount of diseases and pests that can thrive in the UK environment has changed from previous years when regulations around pests were first introduced. I know that this is the Minister's first outing, so I would apologise for the large amount of questions that I fired on her by this one here. There is cross-party support for robust biosecurity in relation to plant health. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, for those members who have not yet collected their tree, Extinction Rebellion are providing a free tree to every member in New Palace Yard. I've been out to collect my tree. I got an English oak with my name on it, and in fact I walked past the Minister's tree that is sitting out there for her to collect, I'm sure, in a bit. Ensuring that we have a robust set of plant health and biosecurity for our natural habitat, especially the native species that Extinction Rebellion are giving out as an example, is going to be very important whether we remain in the European Union or not, because we need to make sure we have robust systems in place. I'd be grateful if the Minister could address a few of those questions when she comes to take her place at the dispatch box shortly. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm afraid we're here again for the second SI in a row, correcting mistakes from previous statutory instruments because the government rushed them through too fast. Now, just as we had before, the opposition won't be opposing this because this was a mistake in a previous SI that the government pushed through when at the time we highlighted that there could be errors in these because of the speed that they were being pushed through. And I'm grateful to the new Minister, who I welcome to the main chamber, having welcomed him in a debate in Westminster Hall, for setting out that this statutory instrument corrects the drafting in a previous SI in relation to this. The rest of the Minister's speech was very nice, but that was a piece of statutory instrument that we had already passed. The only thing that this statutory instrument does is allows the Minister to make regulations, because in error the previous statutory instrument said that he could only make them in writing, which is administrative actions that wouldn't carry the same weight as regulatory actions in relation to CITES and other wildlife protection legislation. Now, there's cross-party agreement that that legislation is very important, and indeed some of the interventions that the Minister had are on topics that are also very important, if nothing to do with this statutory instrument. The only thing that this statutory instrument does is corrects the mistake of the Minister's predecessor. And I do feel for him a wee bit in that respect, because he had to say a lot of nice words before he got to the meat of it, which was, here's another mistake we've made and we're going to correct it. But I'm very grateful to the whips for putting this in the main chamber rather than to have this in a committee room where no one would have known that the government has yet again made a mistake on its statutory instruments, but to give us a platform for all the countless people that like watching statutory instruments on parliamentlive.tv to be able to see this one here. And so let me say briefly to the Minister, I have high hopes for this Minister here. His insurgent and provocative manners on the back benches to try and drive change from the government in relation to animal welfare in particular, I hope will pay dividends, because in the past we've had lots of sound bites, lots of promises, many consultations, but very little action when it comes to these, and indeed many ministers, as my honourable friend says. But I have high hopes that he will not accept the rum deal that his predecessors have been putting out. And indeed, as the Minister who spoke before, I know that he will be robust in this, and I hope that this will be the last time that either him or the Minister who spoke before will have to come to the House to correct SIs that have been pushed through too fast, without proper scrutiny or without proper work. I suspect there will be other errors that will be found, in particular in the surge of statutory instruments in around February and March time this year. Because this is not the first, nor is it the second, nor is it the third statutory instrument that we have had to correct as a House for drafting errors. And I would politely say to the Minister that I believe that there is a piece of work that could usefully be done by DEFRA officials who, to be fair to them, have had the largest number of statutory instruments to get through. And although there's no blame being attached to them, I think the speed in which those SIs have been reviewed will inevitably have included some gremlins, like this one here, court. And this was an important one to catch, because the powers that the Minister set out in Article 7 are important, and we need to make sure that the Secretary of State has the ability to correct and to make regulations rather than just to make administrative pronouncements. I would encourage the Minister to not accept any of those errors and to make sure that there's a robust process in place, because I suspect this won't be the last time that he will have to stand at a dispatch box to correct a statutory instrument that has gone wrong in the past. But I do encourage him to carry on fighting the good fight, because there is lots to be done on animal welfare and climate change in his department, and on behalf of the opposition we wish him well in doing that, because there is cross-party support for more robust animal welfare action, and as we've seen from the protesters outside, more robust action in climate change as well. Thank you.